If there's one thing more terrifying than dealing with your own student loans, it's the idea of watching your child struggle with it as well. In this episode, we have a conversation about not just getting your child into the school of their choice, but doing so with as much aid as possible. Let's get started. Are your student loan payments or loan balances a major obstacle in your financial life? Then tune in and let's escape student loan debt. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. This is one that's a little bit unique. I'm hoping that you all enjoy it. But before I even get into why we're having this podcast episode, I want to tell you that we are actually right around the corner from our 100th episode of the Escape Student Loan Debt podcast. And if you are unaware, we release this podcast every other week. And we have our separate, unrelated New Money, New Problems podcast on general financial literacy for people who are the first or second in their family to earn a certain amount of money. That's released every week. So we are right around the corner from 100 episodes on Escape Student Loan Debt. We're at episode like 170 on New Money, New Problems. That means in the last 3 years, we have produced almost 300 podcast episodes. And I will tell you that no matter how vain it may make me seem, when you are doing that amount of work, sometimes it really helps to have some positive reinforcement. So what I would love to do in advance of our 100th episode is invite you, if you have benefited at all in any way in terms of your student loan journey from this podcast, to let us know about it. I would love if you would send us a voice note to hello@brinsonsolutions.com, or if you want to type out an email about something big or small that we've told you about student loans, shared with you that helped your journey. We would like to have our 100th episode be a celebration of how far we've come. So I'm definitely hoping that as much as we've enjoyed giving you this information, that you've benefited from it as well. And if you have, I would really personally appreciate it if you would share your story. We, of course, will de-identify it as needed, but we want that 100th episode to be a joint celebration of our team's work and potentially and hopefully the benefits that you've received along the way. So once again, hello@brinsonsolutions.com. Send in your stories. Now to today's episode. This is actually something that we are republishing from New Money, New Problems. We had a conversation last week with my friend Jack Wang. And Jack Wang, he operates his own podcast called the Smart College Buyer Podcast. We'll link to it in the show notes. And all he does is consult with families on not just getting their children into certain colleges, but having a strategy to make sure that they are pursuing colleges that will give them as much aid as possible. And while I know that everybody who listens to this podcast doesn't have children, we have a great many listeners who do. And many of their concerns when it comes to not just student loans, but also their children is, man, I hate this and I will not or do not want my child to go through the exact same thing that I'm going through. So I thought it would be beneficial to have Jack on and have a little bit break from the norm in terms of what we typically talk about on this podcast, and hear some insights as to what really moves the needle when it comes to getting your child merit-based aid, because I can tell you what you think leads to aid probably isn't what really leads to aid, and in many cases, as Jack will share, it actually works against you. So as we head into the holiday season, I hope you enjoy this departure from the norm. After I stop talking, you'll hear a brief transition, and then the next voice you hear will be me again, introducing Jack to the Escape Student Loan Debt podcast. I hope you enjoy it. On this week's episode, we have a friend of mine who has dedicated his specialization in his career to just that. And I would love to have Jack come on to the podcast and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Bren, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Glad we were able to make this work. So I really thank you so much. Yeah, so my name is Jack Wang for all the New Money, New Problems podcast listeners. I'm actually from the Boston, Massachusetts area, and I specialize in helping families across the country with strategies on how to maximize aid for college to lower the cost, and then also helping families develop strategies to then pay that bill, because chances are college is still going to cost you something right? Probably most kids don't get a full ride, even though that would be nice. So really look at that end of it. And as I often say to people, who are concerned about student debt, and maybe the parents have or had some of their own student debt, is look in the when your kids are going through this, you can either spend the time planning now, meaning before your kids go to college, or you can simply end up spending the money later, right? And perhaps incurring even more debt, which is what we don't want. So glad to be here. I love what I do. It's definitely unique niche and comes with its own sort of weird benefits because I visit a lot of college campuses, but I absolutely love it. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And I referenced the fact that it took a while to get here. I owe you public apologies, which I will issue now. One of probably the most horrifying moments of my professional career, I accidentally stood up Jack not once, but twice in trying to get this episode published. But he was so gracious to come and trust me a third time. So first, thank you for your grace and courtesy. But I want to ask the question, there's a lot of industries when it comes to like these periphery industries for college planning, where they specialize on just the maximization of aid. There's a lot of financial advisors as well, but there's not many financial advisors who specialize in optimizing and maximizing aid. How did you stumble into or choose this specialty?
Yeah. And actually, by license, I am a financial advisor, except I only focus in this area. And how I stumbled upon it was really through a personal need. So I feel like a lot of times when people get into the work that they do or a particular niche that they operate in, it's usually for some reason, right? We don't just wake up and decide to do this. So years ago, very simply, I was going through a divorce. And my two sons at the time were middle school age. And my then ex-wife and I were trying to, negotiate and come up with a divorce settlement. And so we need to figure out something for the college piece beyond just the typical, like each parent will contribute, to the best of their ability or something, which is pretty stock language. Coincidentally, at that time, I was playing in a men's baseball league. And one of my teammates was at that time a financial aid administrator for an extremely internationally well-known college here in the Boston area. So in between innings, he was very generous with his time, and I was asking him all sorts of questions on really asking for myself, right? Because I needed to know as I was going through that divorce process. We're still really, really good friends today. And we still speak regularly. But at that time, I realized, wow, if it's so complicated for me, and I was asking for myself, other people must want to know as well. And so I found as I started to get into it and start to help people and start to learn more myself, I realized that, wow, there's really not a lot of people who do this. As you said, there's people on the periphery, and then there's financial advisors, but nobody really sort of does both or incorporates both.
That's a great point. It is really a black box when it comes to what colleges are looking for. At least that's what it seems like. So I would ask you this. I want to walk you kind of through the journey of the typical family with which we interact. And I would love if I'm pointing out the path that they're following, trying to get their child aid, for you to kind of identify, well, here's the part of that that's a good idea. Here's the part of that that's a little oversold, if that makes sense.
Okay.
The first group that we typically come across are people who have decided, I have identified the top private school in my area. It costs $25,000 a year, $35,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. But from kindergarten through 12th, if my kid goes there, they can write their own ticket and they're going to get a free ride because of just all these things that they have access to at this school. Can you articulate how colleges look at like the top private schools? What part of that is myth? What part of it is reality?
Yeah, so it's a lot of angles on this one, and I love this example. So remember that as families go through this process, right, of finding college for their kids, different people answer different questions. And so traditionally, 99% of the world, the student works with their guidance counselor at their high school, whether it be public or private. But that guidance counselor and what families are focused on, especially the students are focused on, is answering the question of where can I get in, right? Or what do I need to do to get in? It's purely about getting in. And what I feel, and part of what I do for work is I help families answer the question of what schools will give you the most aid, which is a different question with a different answer. So back to your example of, let's say, a top-tier private school. So remember that colleges, even though that they might be a nonprofit college, but they are still fundamentally businesses, and they're businesses looking for certain types of customers. And I can tell you that colleges, in particular the private colleges, they love kids who go to private high schools from a missions and financial standpoint, because they know that if a family's already paying $25,000 a year or $50,000 a year, I know private high schools that go for like $80,000 a year, right? They know that those families can already afford that expenditure. And so in a very weird way, the students are more likely to get in if you go to a top tier private school, not only because of academics, but the colleges, they're not idiots, right? They know, look, if you're going to private school and you're paying $25,000, $50,000, $80,000 a year, your family probably has a few bucks. And so they're seeing dollar signs to let that kid go from that private school to that college. It's also kind of weird. Colleges understand this game and understand the psychology, so those kids are also likely to get a small scholarship, right? Like $10,000 to the college or something. To the college, it doesn't make a huge difference because they're not giving you a ton of money, but it gives the parents and the students something to brag about. Oh, I got into XYZ college and they gave me a scholarship, right? So if you think about the psychology of it, if a college costs $90,000 a year and they give a $10,000 scholarship, the net cost is $80,000. But saying to your family at Thanksgiving dinner, hey, I got a $10,000 scholarship, so now I'm paying $80,000, is a lot better psychologically than saying I got into a college that just costs $80,000 a year, but there was no scholarship, right? The net cost is the same, but the feeling's different. So colleges really, really understand this. So you go to a top-tier private high school, your chances of getting into a top-tier college are actually better, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a lot of aid, right? And families have to decide sort of what question is more important to them. Are they really focused on just getting their kid into that college and not really worrying about the money? Or they're really focused on, I want my kid to go to college, but I really need to worry about the money.
It's crazy because I'll talk to the parents of those children when they're at like kindergarten age, and then, man, I've been doing this long enough now that there are some where I've like seen them through to the college age, and the parents are always shocked when their child picks a school that's very similar to the school that they attended for high school. And I'm like, well, this is what you got them used to, right? Like most kids don't go from this type of school to their local state school. And it sounds like you're saying, yeah, they may get in, but this dream that these parents have of, oh, if I just pay for their costs K through 12, they're going to get a full ride to the college of their choice, that may not be likely.
Yeah, no, it's very unlikely. Very few kids get full ride. I mean, it does happen, and we can talk about sort of what colleges look for when they do offer that. But it's not very likely. The colleges are really seeing dollar signs like, hey, you have the ability to pay this amount for a private high school, so that means you have the ability to pay us. Now, one thing about sort of that high school versus college environment that most people don't think of it as a financial cost or financial impact, but really is. So something that I spend a lot of time talking to families and students about is sort of the fit, right? And when I say the fit, I don't mean academic fit, but simple basic things like, is the school far away or close to home? Is it big versus small? Is it what kind of setting, urban, suburban, rural, or whatever? Is it hot there versus cold? And so if you think about it, kind of like buying a house, right? You might be looking for a 4-bedroom house, but 4-bedroom houses exist everywhere. but that doesn't mean you're liking it. So when you're shopping for a house, you're looking at the area, the neighborhood, like maybe your commute time to the office, right? All these things that sort of are not specific to the house, but still have an impact on your choice of whether or not you buy that house. And so I encourage families to really look at this and like, does the kid really want to go there? Because they have to live there for the next 4 or so years. But the reason it's a financial factor is because a not insignificant, in other words, a fairly sizable chunk of students each year will transfer colleges for whatever reason. And I don't mean they're flunking out. They could be transferring because too hot, too cold, too close to home, too far from home, don't like the roommate, don't like the food. I mean, you wouldn't believe how big a factor that is. But when they transfer, they incur something called transfer leakage. And what I mean by that is, the student will want to transfer from college A to college B, but college B will say, hey, that math class you took at college A? We don't count that as a math class here at college B, so you have to retake that class. And that lengthens out the time to graduation. Of course, the longer you take to graduate, the more money it's going to cost you. Right. So I spend a lot of time sort of like, hey, can you see yourself actually like living here and enjoying it and et cetera, right? Beyond just sort of the academics and what the rankings are or whatever. Like you actually have to like the place because you're going to be there for a while.
Great point. Well, now let's bring up the second camp. The second camp says, I am going to go the public school route. I'm going to try to get my child into a magnet school or a specialty school, or they're going to go to their local public school, and I am going to extracurricular them to death, right? They're going to play sports. They're going to be on the debate team. They're going to do all these things. And when it comes time to apply, we're going to lean on their test scores, the gifted program that they may be in, and all these extracurriculars. And that's going to get them into the school of their choice and get them, the mythical full ride. So what part of that is myth and what part of that is reality?
So does extracurriculars or do extracurriculars help the student become a better applicant? The answer to that simply, of course, is yes, right? You want to be a well-rounded student. You want to have multiple interests, and colleges do look for that. Some colleges value that more than others. Some colleges value particular extracurriculars more than others. So, for example, I know that there's a college out there where if you achieve the Eagle Scout ranking and you do Boy Scouts, they give you an extra scholarship for that. There's another college that's local to me where if you are in a sort of a business-related organization, like business leaders or future business leaders, something like that, or like a DECA, which is a marketing thing, they'll give you an extra scholarship for that. So different colleges have different preferences. However, again, this is going back to sort of, are you trying to get the kid in or are you trying to maximize aid? Because those are different questions. One of the things that I've noticed, and speaking with the missions reps at the colleges as well as independent, is the more competitive college you apply to. Like if you're applying to like an Ivy League or near Ivy League or something, you really, in an ideal world, you really want your extracurriculars to align with your intended major. So for example, if you're going to study engineering, right, but your extracurricular is writing poetry, and don't get me wrong, I have nothing against poetry, okay, that's not it. But one of the things that colleges will look at is, hey, how serious is this kid about engineering if they don't do anything outside the classroom that is remotely related to engineering? Instead, they write poetry, right? Now, that doesn't make for a bad student or a bad kid. That kid could still get in. But the higher levels, they're looking for like, hey, are you actually serious about this? And they're looking for that. So I wouldn't just load up your kid with just all sorts of different extracurriculars. If you know that your kid likes a particular path and your intent is to pursue one of these sort of top 50 or top 20, top 50 colleges, then you got to think about, okay, I want to do a bunch of extracurriculars, but is it all aligned with what the student is actually intending to study? Now, will any of that get your kid a free ride at college? Again, at most schools, the answer is no. but it does matter for kids getting in. And at some schools, it can, all other things being equal, get you a little bit more aid if you were sort of focusing your extracurricular activities versus if you were not focused.
This is great. It was so profound what you said. You probably say it in passing, but when you're like, hey, there's a big difference between your kid getting in and your kid getting aid. I've never heard it phrased that way. So what I want to do is before the break, if you can articulate what are some things that really do move the needle when it comes to getting aid versus getting in?
Okay. So here there's a lot of myths. And so let me just start by saying, like, people, I get asked questions all the time. Is there like a secret code to the financial aid the financial aid forms, or like a sequence of buttons you got to press? Or like, what happens if you go bury all of your money in your backyard, right? That's going to give you aid. That is generally a myth. Okay. So do not go bury money in your backyard. It doesn't really do anything. And no amount of jumping jacks you're going to do or blinking is going to give you the secret code to financial aid. But it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is colleges are businesses. And so it is a fallacy. It is a myth to think that colleges are just looking for students. Yeah, they are. But what they're really looking for are particular types of students. And so the best analogy for this, right, almost a perfect analogy, is the professional football NFL draft. When your kid applies to school, whatever college, right, they're comparing your student against all the other students. And so if your student's a first-round draft pick, so if you think about the NFL, if you're a first-round draft pick, you get a much bigger contract than if you were a seventh-round draft pick, right? Yes, you still got drafted, meaning quote-unquote accepted, but your contract is tiny compared to that first-round pick. But teams also draft for like position, right? Like if you need a quarterback, you take a quarterback. If you don't need one, you don't take one that high, or you don't take one at all. So colleges are looking for like certain majors, certain like geographic origin, like what part of the country they might be from, or international, or even gender, boy versus girl, or a combination of all of those things, or either other factors. So the bottom line is that the more the student can check those boxes for the college, right, and help the college meet its goals, then the more aid the student is going to get. Period.
Is it possible to kind of integrate that into, I know a lot of colleges, you have to write letters and things is it possible to kind of structure your application where you are identifying for them how you fit in that mold?
You can, yeah. Actually, there are strategies, and so one of the things that all colleges know around the country is that like 85 to 90% of all students go within a 250-mile radius. Okay, because it's what we see, it's what we're most familiar with, it's what we grew up with, right? So here in the Boston area, 250 miles is roughly like New York City, maybe a little bit past. I don't know what it is for where you are in Nashville. But, I get students all the time here in New England or wherever, and they say, okay, I grew up here in the Boston area, but I want to go to UCLA, right? Or something on the West Coast, okay? And that student puts in an application and they're hoping that their test scores are good enough. UCLA already knows that there's virtually no chance that that student is showing up. So even if that student's accepted, right, this has an implication on money because there's only so much aid in the aid budget each year. So if UCLA doesn't think that that kid from Massachusetts is going to show up, even if UCLA accepts that student, they're not likely to give that student a lot of money because generally speaking, no matter how much money that college sort of gives that student, they know that that student's probably not going to go across the country, right? Versus in the case of like UCLA, maybe there's a student from Nevada or something, or Arizona, who is likely to go in UCLA or some other school can entice them with some amount of aid. And colleges are really good at figuring this out. But you know what's not on the admissions application? On an admissions application, nowhere does it ask the student, hey, if we accept you, are you actually serious about showing up? And so as a student or family, let's say you have relatives in LA that you visit all the time, or or some other reason, right? So you're out there in that area all the time. So it's no big deal for you to go out there and then ultimately go to college. That information is nowhere on the application, right? Nowhere. So students have to communicate it differently to that school and say, hey, by the way, UCLA or whatever school, right? Hey, if you accept me, I'm actually going to show up, right? Because I'm out in your area all the time anyway. And so now that changes the calculus to where, okay, maybe it doesn't necessarily improve the odds of the kid getting in, but it definitely now improves the odds of the kid getting aid because now they actually know you're a little bit more serious. There's a whole game behind this.
This is I'm literally thinking to myself like, all right, we got to take a break. Otherwise, we're going to be here for 2 hours because this is such good stuff. All right, so we're going to take a break, and after the break, we're going to talk about like when the optimization process starts and some concepts you've walked me through when it comes to like target schools, backup schools, and the like. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Escape Student Loan Debt Podcast.
Subscribe now at escapestudentloandebt.com.
Welcome back.
We are back, and I want to start the second half of this episode with the question of, once you've gotten all this information and you know the pros and the benefits of structuring your application the right way, when does this process begin? Like, if you are a parent of a young child, at what age do you start trying to have some intentionality for aiming for a college?
Right. Great question. A lot of confusion around this. So if you go by the typical timeline that's given to your student, or given to you as the parent from your high school guidance counselor, what they're going to tell you is that it typically starts junior year and really starts to pick up the spring of junior year. A couple reasons for this. Why is it the spring of junior year? Well, guidance counselors are really busy with their seniors getting applications out in the fall, right? The fall of the senior year. So they don't have time to talk to anybody else. But once that fall semester is over, the guidance counselors have largely gotten their applications out for the seniors, and now the seniors are just waiting on where they got in. So now guidance counselors have time to talk to the juniors, right? Which is why it always happens during the springtime. And during the springtime, and during the fall of junior year, guidance counselors might tell students to take the PSAT, maybe take the SAT for real or ACT in the spring, and that's when really college visits really get going. But let's play out the timeline. So, excuse me. So when you look at the applications themselves, you apply for admissions to college in the fall of senior year, typically, right? You also apply for financial aid at the same time, typically fall, winter, senior year. Now, specifically on the financial part, so we're recording in the fall of 2025. So let's just pretend that if you have a high school senior now, you filled out the financial aid forms now. The financial aid forms are based on your most recently completed tax returns. So in fall of 2025, your most recently completed tax return is for 2024, or the calendar year that spans 2024. But if you think about what grade your kid was in during calendar year 2024 and work backwards, that's really the spring of sophomore year through that summer, through the fall of junior year. That's known as the base year. And so if your kid's going to go to college in fall of 26, you apply to financial aid in fall of 25 using the using the tax return for 2024. That's why we call it a prior tax year, right? Because it's 2 years prior to the year you are in college, or you're going to be. So now think about what I just said. Right? Most families and pretty much every timeline you get from every high school guidance counselor, you don't think about college of any sort until junior year. And really spring of junior. But I just said that financially you have to start, right? Your base year starts spring of sophomore year, right? So it starts earlier than parents think. And so if there are certain financial strategies that might make sense, so we talked about, so sometimes we'll talk about gifting if parents, let's say, have non-qualified investments, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, whatever. or they own their own business. There's some income shifting strategies or even gifting strategies. I typically would love to have parents start as early as freshman year of high school, because it gives us time to do stuff and get it done before it hits the tax return of when it makes a difference, right? Because remember, a financial aid form and a tax return always show what has already happened. You can't go back and unring that bell. So if you're going to do anything, right, you need to get it done before the tax return or the financial aid form reporting period, so that it already happened, so it doesn't hit the tax return that'll negatively impact you. Now, of course, what people say to me then is like, but Jack, I don't, my kid just got to high school, right? My kid's a freshman in high school, but my kid just got there, and you want me to start talking about college already? It's like, yeah, we can make some estimates, and, you know, I can give you sort of the landscape of how the world works and stuff, and whatever. Now, on the admissions side, it starts out early too. So we talked about like sort of the extracurriculars, right? And, you know, colleges look at, you know, you're better off having one extracurricular that you did all 4 years of college versus having 4 one-year activities, right? Because you show they can stick with it in the 4-year example. So that's got to start freshman year. Another thing also that a lot of parents don't think about is there are 2 standardized tests. There's SAT and ACT. They're very different tests. Colleges accept both. But especially here in the Northeast, we're very SAT-centric. There's no question. You're taking the SAT, right? And if you score high enough, great, you submit it. If you don't, you don't. But how do you know your kid is going to be better at the SAT? So I tell families, like, you want to maybe take a practice SAT maybe sophomore year, and maybe take a practice ACT sophomore year. Figure out which one you're better at, right? And then whichever one that is, then when you take it for real, that's the one you want to focus on. You don't want to find out like the end of your junior year that you're bombing the SAT and all along you would have been better at the ACT or vice versa, because that's kind of too late, right? You want to figure this out beforehand. So it really starts both on the missions and financial side. It starts way earlier than most people think.
Let's say that you have a family who, I would imagine that most families come to you late, right? Like, you know, like when they're coming to you where it's kind of like the die has already been cast, unfortunately. But regardless of when they come, you're now at the stage where the child is putting together their list, right? You know, here are the potential options. And I know that you can give some guidance in those areas. How do you look at the student, their grades, their extracurriculars, and start to guide them on a realistic list?
Yeah, so I do help create the list. And, you know, sometimes students will have their own list from their guidance counselor or their independent counselor that they might be working with, or they might have it from the parents because the parents might say, hey, I went here, so you got to go here, type of thing. I get that a lot too. So a couple things, you know, I'm looking at, you know, I spend a lot of time again talking about fit. What kind of environment do they want? You know, do they have an idea of what they want to do for a major, right? How generous is the school with their aid policies, either merit scholarships or financial aid? And by the way, the myth is that those are 2 different pots of money. Those are absolutely not. They're more interrelated than most people think. So I'll look at all of those and try to come up with a list, and then we'll start to narrow down from there. But I also spend a lot of time visiting colleges around the country, and while I can't get to all 2,500 colleges, there's certain telltale indicators. So, for example, like if your student wants to study business, okay, most parents will look at like the U.S. News and World Report list or whatever ranking list, and like, oh yeah, this school has a really good business program, and it's the largest major there, whatever, okay. I can tell you that is a contraindicator. So if that major is already the largest one at that school, they really don't need you, right? Because they're already getting enough applications for that major to be the largest one, right? But now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking for the smallest major. That's not always the case. But there are certain indicators, and especially with public schools, you can tell if they want in-state versus out-of-state students, they'll start to look for. I also filter the list by how the formulas work. So, for example, in the case of divorced parents, one formula is a little bit more, can be more advantageous than the other. So we might filter those schools by, these schools only use this formula, right? If you have, let's say, a lot of like elder care expenses, the other formula is a little bit more friendly to that, right? So there's those nuances. So I might filter for that as well. And then on top of all of that, let's say your top school is whatever school it is, right? That's the one you're sort of realistic target. People always ask, can you appeal for more money? Can you ask for more money for a college? And can you use another college's offer to negotiate against this college? The short answer to those questions is yes, you can. But again, there's a strategy. So let's say you want to go to XYZ University. I'll say, okay, let's look up that college's competitors, not what you and I as parents think, Brendan, is what does the college think? And I might say, okay, so we're applying these schools, but I'll have you throw an application for this other school that XYZ views as a competitor for the sole purpose of generating an award letter that we can then use to negotiate against XYZ. But it can't just be any school, right? Again, there's a strategy and intentionality behind that too. So, but yeah, I mean, so that's the very high level overview, sort of how lists get developed, as opposed to what most students do is they look at rankings, they listen to so they figure out where their friends or older siblings have gone. Believe it or not, the college basketball March Madness tournament is a huge driver of so when you have that Cinderella team, right, that makes it to like the Elite Eight or something like we've had in the past, that school, you'll notice that the applications to that school jump up because kids are watching, they're hearing about it. Oh, XYZ school making a huge Cinderella deep into the tournament. I mean, so kids get all sorts of sources, but what kids and most parents are not looking at is the financial aspect first.
It's funny you say that, and this actually leads to my last question, and it's a concept I've actually seen that you walk through in person. I'm in Nashville, as you said, and it's funny because there's a lot of articles out there it's talking about kids from the Northeast who are, oh, I'm not applying to Ivy League, I'm applying to Vandy as my safety school. I'm like, do you have any idea how hard it is to get into Vanderbilt? Like, that's not, I don't think that's a safety school, right?
Right.
But I've seen you talk about like, hey, you want to go to this school. Maybe you get in, but if you don't, have you thought about that school? So I want you to give me some examples of, hey, I might have, it doesn't have to be Harvard, right? But like, I have someone who wants to go to Harvard. Maybe they get in, but if they don't, or they get in, but they don't get any aid, there's a school like this that I want to introduce them to. Can you give me some examples of that?
Yeah, so it's just so funny with Vanderbilt, and one of the misconceptions that families have going through this process is a lot of parents will sort of think that, hey, college and admissions and financial aid works just like when they went through the process 20, 30 years ago, right? They might not always say that, but you can tell in your conversations with them, oh, no. So Vandy's easy to get into, or some of the schools here in New England that used to be more like commuter schools, very easy to get to, now have Ivy League acceptance rates, right? So, for example, if you look at like engineering schools, a Georgia Tech, MIT, obviously, Carnegie Mellon, right? Those are excellent universities. But a great alternative, for example, and a much less expensive alternative, and still has phenomenal programs, is University of Alabama at Huntsville. It's a public institution. Huntsville is also the home to, I think, the Space Force, or like big, like Raytheon. Yeah, so it's a phenomenal school with a phenomenal engineering program, right? But it costs a fraction of what Carnegie Mellon and Georgia Tech might cost. If you're looking for example for let's say like a business school or something, right? Because you want to major in business. I'm actually a big fan of some liberal arts schools for that, but also Ohio Wesleyan is great. Syracuse is great. University of Dayton in Ohio. I love them because they're fairly generous with aid, but more importantly, they're big believers in experiential learning opportunities. In fact, I believe it's Ohio Wesleyan. Like you have to do an internship, but let's say you intern, let's say for a nonprofit, right? So the nonprofit can't pay you. The school has a fund where if you do that internship, the school will just pay you, right? Because they want you to do it, right? Syracuse does that with their business school, honors college. University of Dayton, I think, has a work component also. Um, you know, and so there's lots of these examples that are great schools throughout the country that give you great education, but the cost can be a lot less. And in fact, actually, even for engineering, most people think, well, I'm gonna go to engineering school, but you can go to a liberal arts school that has an engineering program, and because liberal arts schools aren't right stereotypically known for engineering, all things being equal, you might get more aid. Now, it's not just about majors. Some public schools really want out-of-state students. So up in my area, for example, University of Maine loves out-of-state students. Right now, the SUNY system, which is the State University of New York, they're basically matching in-state tuition with some of like the New England states. So as an out-of-stater, you can go to a New York school for no more than your in-state tuition. But other state schools really don't want out-of-staters because they have enough in-state. Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, and California are good examples of that, right? So you might get in, but you're not going to get aid from them because, again, they don't need you. But then even also like gender. So one of the examples that I will talk about is Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. So they're a STEM school, right? It's in the name, Rochester Institute of Technology. It's a beautiful school, beautiful campus. But they have phenomenal business programs. But because it's an engineering school, it's like 70% male. And like almost all of them are in engineering. So if you have a student who's a girl and maybe wants to study business or like visual, like graphic design, and you apply to RIT, you're going to get a lot more aid because the school's working hard to balance out the majors and balance out the gender ratio, right? So that's an example of, instead of trying to fight your way into a University of Chicago business school, which is phenomenal, or Northwestern, or like a Boston University or Vanderbilt for business school, you can go to RIT for a fraction of the cost, and they really want you. And just so, by the way, this shows up in the award letters, right? So if you look at some of these top tier schools, and I just happen to know Boston University off the top of my head, but every year their freshman class, roughly half of their freshman class pays full sticker price of like $95,000, right? So those kids got in, but they did not get aid, right? Now there's different reasons of why they might have chosen that, but a lot of these top schools, because they don't really need sort of the average applicant, they're like, okay, we'll let you in, but we're not going to give you aid. The family has to decide, is it worth the money? Is it are you really into that prestige of saying that your kid goes to an Ivy League or Vanderbilt or whatever? Or is it really like you want a good or great college experience, but you just need to pay a lot less for it, right? And the family has to figure that out.
I could talk to you about this for much, much longer, but I would love if you would tell our audience how they can reach you, and just tell us about your platform.
Yeah, so what I encourage everyone to do is actually go to my podcast, which you're a guest on coming up in the next couple of months. So the name of my podcast is called Smart College Buyer. It's on all the major platforms, where I talk about all these issues, student loan repayment, but also like admissions, financial aid, whatever. And I'll have great guests such as yourself on as well to talk about different aspects of college and college life. Or they can find me on LinkedIn or any of the social media platforms. Look up Smart College Buyer or Jack Wang. And they can connect with me there, because I also post a lot of like short videos on more timely topics that come up in this world. So yeah, I love doing it. I love helping people. I think I'll just sort of end on this. The family really has to decide what's more important. And I have had my share of families who, not in these direct words, but in talking with them, you can just tell, like, they're living vicariously through their kid. Their kid must go to Ivy League, or they literally think that the kid's life's going to be over. And I recently had a family where, again, they didn't say these words, but you could just tell the parents are like, if our kid doesn't go to Ivy League, they're going to bring shame to the family or something. And I'm like, A, that's not true. And B, you don't have the money for this. Okay. So now, of course, I didn't say that, but
Hey, sometimes
but families have to figure out what's important,
truth
right?
needs to be plain and spoken clearly. So, wise words from a wise man. Jack, I am sorry for how long it took us to do this, but it was well worth the wait. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being a guest on the New Money, New Problems podcast.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it, Brandon.
From Escape Student Loan Debt, this was the Escape Student Loan Debt podcast, a show for established professionals whose student loan payments or loan balances are impacting their marriage, their business, their credit, or their dream of achieving homeownership.